In this episode, we move into one of the most practical decision points in the whole certified in risk and information systems control, CRISC, journey, because once a risk has been identified, analyzed, and reported, the organization has to decide what it is actually going to do next. For a brand new learner, this is where risk management starts to feel very real, because the conversation is no longer only about what might happen or how serious the impact could be. It becomes a business choice about whether the organization will live with the exposure, reduce it, shift part of the burden somewhere else, or step away from the activity creating the problem. That choice matters because every response carries trade-offs in cost, time, disruption, accountability, and residual exposure. A mature organization does not treat risk treatment as a reflex or as a purely technical fix. It treats it as a disciplined decision about how to pursue business objectives while staying within a level of uncertainty and harm that leadership can responsibly tolerate. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful place to begin is by understanding what risk treatment really means. Risk treatment is the set of actions or decisions the organization uses to change its exposure after a risk has been assessed and understood well enough for leadership or an owner to make an informed choice. That means the goal is not always to make the risk disappear, because in real business environments that is often impossible, too expensive, or not even necessary. Instead, the goal is to choose the response that makes the most sense in light of business objectives, current controls, operational realities, legal obligations, and the amount of residual risk leadership is willing to carry. This is why treatment is closely tied to judgment rather than automatic rules. Two organizations facing a similar technical issue may choose different responses because their dependence on the affected process, their tolerance for disruption, their resources, and their strategic goals are not the same. Risk treatment, therefore, is not about finding one universally correct answer. It is about selecting the most responsible answer for the organization's actual context. The four core options in this topic are accept, mitigate, transfer, and avoid, and the easiest way to understand them is to hear them as different ways of handling the same fundamental problem. Acceptance means the organization knowingly decides to live with the remaining exposure. Mitigation means it takes steps to reduce the likelihood or impact of the risk. Transfer means it shifts some of the financial or operational burden to another party, though never all responsibility. Avoidance means it changes or stops the activity that creates the exposure in the first place. These options matter because they force clarity. A risk cannot just sit in a vague middle space where people say it is being handled without anyone defining what that means. Once the treatment option is named clearly, leadership can examine whether the decision matches the seriousness of the exposure and whether the supporting actions, documentation, and ownership make sense. This is one reason the exam cares so much about this topic. Good risk treatment shows that the organization can translate analysis into disciplined business action. Acceptance is often misunderstood, so it deserves careful attention early. Accepting a risk does not mean ignoring it, forgetting it, or deciding it is unimportant. It means the organization understands the exposure, understands what remains after current controls are considered, and deliberately decides that the residual level is acceptable for now in light of business priorities and available alternatives. This may happen because the cost of further reduction is too high compared with the likely harm, because a larger strategic change is already planned, or because the activity is important enough that the business chooses to operate with some remaining uncertainty. Acceptance, therefore, can be a responsible decision, but only when it is informed, documented, and owned at the right level. It becomes irresponsible when people drift into it without making the decision consciously. A team that delays treatment because of competing priorities may be living with the risk, but if no one has formally acknowledged that choice, the organization is not practicing risk acceptance well. It is simply tolerating exposure without proper governance. Mitigation is the option most people think of first because it sounds the most like traditional security work. To mitigate a risk is to reduce it by strengthening controls, improving oversight, changing processes, adding detection, increasing resilience, or redesigning some part of the environment so the harmful event becomes less likely or less damaging. Mitigation does not always mean deploying a technical safeguard, even though it can include that. It may also involve better vendor review, clearer change approval, stronger training, improved backup testing, tighter access governance, or stronger segregation of duties. The important idea is that mitigation aims to push the residual risk down by changing the conditions shaping the exposure. Still, mitigation is not always the best answer in every case. A control improvement may be expensive, slow, disruptive, or only partially effective. That is why organizations should not assume mitigation is automatically the mature response. It is a valuable option, but it still must be assessed against cost, practicality, timing, and how much reduction it is realistically expected to achieve. Transfer is another option that can sound simple at first, but becomes much more nuanced once you examine it closely. To transfer risk means shifting some of the financial burden or operational consequence to another party, often through mechanisms such as insurance, outsourcing, contractual agreements, indemnification clauses, or service arrangements that assign certain obligations elsewhere. For example, a company may purchase cyber insurance to help absorb certain costs after an incident, or it may require a vendor contract to include security obligations and liability terms tied to service failure or data handling. The key lesson for beginners is that transfer never removes accountability completely. The organization may shift cost or assign duties, but it still owns the business impact if the service fails, if customers are harmed, or if regulators hold the company responsible for oversight. This means transfer is often helpful, but never magical. It can reduce the financial shock or clarify external responsibilities, yet the organization must still manage vendor performance, review policy limitations, understand exclusions, and prepare for the reality that transferred risk often remains operationally painful even when some part of the burden has been shifted. Avoidance is the most decisive option because it changes the business activity itself rather than trying to reduce or share the exposure around it. If a certain service, technology, process, or relationship creates a level of risk the organization cannot responsibly tolerate, leadership may choose not to begin that activity at all or may stop doing it in its current form. This could mean declining to enter a new market, discontinuing a vulnerable legacy system that cannot be made safe enough, refusing to store a certain category of data, or ending a relationship with a third party whose weakness creates too much uncertainty. Avoidance is powerful because it can eliminate the specific source of exposure being considered, but it often comes with business sacrifice. Revenue opportunity may be reduced, convenience may be lost, transformation plans may slow down, or customer experience may change in ways leaders do not welcome. That is why avoidance is not always the first choice, even when the exposure is serious. It is usually selected when the activity itself is no longer worth the level of risk it naturally creates. Choosing among these options requires more than personal preference. A strong decision begins by looking at the severity of the risk, the likely business consequences, the quality of current controls, and the organization's appetite and tolerance for the remaining exposure. It also requires understanding timing. A risk that affects a critical service during a sensitive operational period may require a faster or more conservative response than a similar risk tied to a lower value activity with strong workarounds. Cost matters as well, but cost should not be treated narrowly. The organization must think about the cost of treatment, the cost of disruption, the cost of inaction, and the possible downstream cost of legal, reputational, or customer harm if the event occurs. Practicality matters too, because some mitigations may not be feasible within the current environment, and some transfer strategies may look attractive until the contract details or policy limitations are examined carefully. Good treatment decisions weigh all of these factors rather than reacting only to the most visible technical symptom. Ownership plays a central role in all of this, because treatment decisions have to be made by someone with the authority to decide how much exposure the business will carry and what resources will be committed in response. This is usually the risk owner, not simply the person who discovered the weakness or the team responsible for the affected technology. A technical team may recommend mitigation, warn against acceptance, or explain why a control improvement is necessary, but the business decision about how to proceed belongs at the level where organizational accountability actually sits. Control owners also matter, because if mitigation is chosen, someone still needs to design, implement, operate, and monitor the safeguards supporting that response. This distinction is important because many weak organizations slide into confusion when risk is identified by one group, felt by another group, and owned by no one clearly enough to decide the path forward. Effective treatment depends on clear ownership, because without it, the organization may talk about the risk repeatedly while never truly deciding whether it is accepted, reduced, transferred, or avoided. Documentation is just as important as the choice itself, because a treatment decision has very little value if the organization cannot later explain what was decided, why it was decided, who approved it, and what residual exposure remains. Good documentation should record the treatment option selected, the supporting rationale, the accountable owner, any deadlines or milestones tied to the response, and any assumptions that influence the decision. If the risk is accepted, the record should show that the acceptance was deliberate and not just the result of delay or neglect. If mitigation is selected, the documentation should clarify whether the planned actions are expected to reduce likelihood, impact, or both, and whether interim exposure remains until the work is complete. If transfer is chosen, the organization should document what exactly is being shifted and what still remains inside its own accountability boundary. If avoidance is selected, the record should show how the activity is being changed or ended. This level of clarity helps the organization review decisions later, defend them when challenged, and avoid the confusion that arises when memory replaces governance. Residual risk remains central throughout this topic because the real question after any treatment choice is what exposure is still left. Mitigation rarely drives the risk to zero. Transfer may shift some financial burden while leaving operational pain in place. Avoidance may reduce one risk while introducing new costs or dependencies elsewhere. Even acceptance should be understood as a decision to live with a specific remaining level, not as a statement that the risk vanished. This is why strong treatment discussions always return to the residual picture. Leaders need to know whether the remaining exposure sits within what the organization can responsibly tolerate and whether that judgment may need to be revisited later if business conditions, threat activity, or dependencies change. A risk treatment decision is not complete simply because the option has been named. It becomes meaningful when the organization understands what remains after the decision, how that remaining exposure will be monitored, and what would cause leadership to revisit the response in the future. A common mistake is assuming that every important risk should automatically be mitigated, because that sounds like the most proactive and responsible answer. In practice, mitigation may be appropriate very often, but it is not always the most sensible option once cost, timing, operational disruption, and strategic direction are considered honestly. Another common mistake is confusing acceptance with laziness. Acceptance can be disciplined and appropriate when leadership knowingly carries the exposure with clear ownership and reporting. On the other hand, many organizations think they have transferred a risk when they have really only outsourced a service or purchased insurance without examining what remains under their own responsibility. There is also a tendency to see avoidance as overreaction, even though in some cases it is the clearest and most mature choice when the activity no longer fits the business's capacity to manage the associated exposure. The broader lesson is that treatment options should not be judged by their tone. They should be judged by how well they fit the organization's risk picture and decision context. It is also important to recognize that treatment can be temporary, staged, or combined rather than singular and final from the first day. An organization may accept a risk for a short period while a mitigation project is underway. It may mitigate part of the exposure while also transferring some of the financial consequences through insurance or contractual protections. It may avoid one especially risky feature of a service while continuing the broader activity in a more controlled form. This is realistic because real organizations often work under timing constraints, budget limits, contractual obligations, and operational dependencies that prevent perfectly clean choices. What matters is not that the response fit a simple textbook shape. What matters is that the combination of actions is intentional, documented, and capable of being explained in terms of the residual exposure that will remain at each stage. This is one reason CRISC treats risk treatment as a business discipline. The response has to fit the messy conditions of real enterprises, not just the clean categories of a slide or a study chart. For exam thinking, one of the best habits is to ask what the organization is really trying to decide and what option best fits that decision. If the scenario emphasizes a deliberate willingness to live with the remaining exposure, acceptance is likely the right idea. If the scenario focuses on strengthening controls or reducing the chance or consequence of a harmful event, mitigation is the likely answer. If the organization is shifting part of the burden to another party through a contract or financial mechanism, transfer is the key concept. But remember that responsibility does not disappear entirely. If the business is changing or stopping the activity itself because the exposure is too high, the answer points to avoidance. The exam will often make two options sound reasonable, so you need to listen for the core action being taken rather than the emotional tone of the wording. CRISC questions often reward the answer that reflects clear ownership, informed business judgment, and realistic treatment of the residual risk rather than the answer that sounds most aggressive or most technical. By the end of this discussion, the central lesson should be clear that understanding risk treatment options means understanding how organizations make disciplined choices after risk has been assessed. Acceptance means knowingly living with the residual exposure. Mitigation means reducing the likelihood or impact through stronger controls or process changes. Transfer means shifting part of the burden to another party without surrendering overall accountability. Avoidance means changing or ending the activity that creates the exposure. Each option can be appropriate in the right context, and each one becomes weak when chosen without ownership, documentation, or clear understanding of what residual risk remains. That is why this topic matters so much in Domain 3. It turns risk management from a description of problems into a set of accountable business decisions. When you can hear the difference between these options and explain why one fits better than another in a given situation, you are thinking the way a strong CRISC professional is expected to think.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.